that she has written, Fractured, the first one, and her latest novel, Let Her Go. So welcome, Dawn. Now, Dawn is a psychiatrist, and she's a mother of 3 young children as well. So Dawn, before we start talking about your books, could you tell us when did you start writing? Is that something you always wanted to do, or did you just accidentally fall into it?
Yeah, I guess it is always something I wanted to do. Even as a kid, I loved writing, particularly reading, like everybody here. And I had a few goes when I was probably 7 or 8 with my pen pal. I mean, people don't have pen pals anymore, which is a big shame. But we used to send books back to each other and add a chapter each. It was wonderful. It was Blyton-esque adventure novels, which were terrible when I look back on them now. But it is always something that I wanted to do. But when I was at school, I really wanted to study English and classics. That was what I really loved. I studied, I went to a school in Scotland where we had to study Latin for all of high school, and I loved it. I loved reading about the old myths and stories, and the use of language was amazing. But somehow, and I'm still not quite sure how it happened, I ended up doing medicine, not English and classics at all. And I'm glad I did, and I guess we'll talk about that as we go as to why I'm glad I did, because I don't think I could be writing this stuff that I'm writing now without having done that. But I always still had that urge to write, so I moved to Australia after graduating in medicine. I'd done a little bit of my intern years in Scotland, moved to Australia, and then it was when I was working as a psychiatry registrar, so as a psychiatrist in training, that I started to get that bug again. And I just began writing little things for things like medical newsletters, psychiatric websites for trainees. It was stuff that anybody could write for them. There was nobody saying that that's good enough or not. So I could pretty much get anything up there. And I'm not sure that anybody ever read them apart from us who produced them. But it was a really great way of learning, I guess, to write succinctly, try and get a point across. And I really just got the bug from there. And then it just started to spread. And I did a couple of little creative writing courses, one at Sydney Uni, just some night classes. And I still remember driving away from my first night class, and I called my husband. I was driving, I shouldn't have been on the phone, but I was. I called him, and I just remember saying to him, this is what I want to do. I just remember having this feeling of elation that I had actually found what I wanted to do in writing, and knowing that I was amongst a group of people that I really felt I belonged, and then I just took from there.
Now, your first novel, Fractured, now it's about quite a harrowing topic. It is difficult. So you tackled that really well in a very sensitive way, I thought, when I read it. It's about a young woman who had her first baby, and she was quite depressed after having the baby, and the depression, and she got worse and worse into and became neuropsychosis, at the term, where she became quite psychotic, and the end result was quite devastating. And the book is done in a very clever way, I thought, going back and forth in time, and it also try to look at different perspectives of another main character, her husband Tony, her husband's mother Ursula, and her and Anna's mother as well, and all the emotions of they felt. Now, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, well, Fractured, it's one of those books, I guess, like many first novels, it's an idea that I had going around in my head for a very long time. And really what started the idea of the was when I was working as a psychiatry registrar. My specialty is child psychiatry. I was doing perinatal psychiatry, so working with mums and babies, so working with pregnant mums and mums who just had newborns. And I was on the very periphery of a few cases like the one of Anna in Fractured. I have to stress that it's certainly not based on anybody in particular, but I heard about these cases, and I was working with women where I guess the big difference for me is previous to that I had been working mainly with I guess chronic schizophrenics on the high intensity wards of the hospitals, and so I was dealing with people that in many ways I found it very hard to identify with. It tended to be older males who'd had a really chronic mental health history. But when I was starting to do perinatal psychiatry, I saw women who really were just like me. They were women who were my age. They were women who tended to have jobs and careers and husbands and reasonably normal families, whatever that means. And these were women who suddenly, after the birth of a child, where they felt they were going to be able to cope, the wheels just fell off and everything went wrong for them. So I really started to think to myself, wow, these are women like me. And then I sort of toyed with writing it, and I tried a few times, and I kind of couldn't get past that first paragraph and thought it was terrible and gave up. And then when I had my own first child, the idea came back again. So we had just moved from Perth to Brisbane at that time. We'd moved when I was about 7.5 months pregnant. I'd worked up until the last day to get my maternity leave and flew to Brisbane. And I found myself in Brisbane. I didn't know a soul. So we got my husband's work and didn't know anyone at all. And I found myself at home with a newborn baby. And I'd been used to working really long hours in the hospital, a really intense job. And it was a big shock to me to suddenly be isolated and at home with a baby. And then I remember when my first baby was about 3 months old, I had one night where I was sitting on the edge of the bed trying to rock her. I was sitting down because I had no energy left to stand. I hadn't slept for more than 2 hours for about 3 weeks or something. And I was crying, and I just remember thinking, this is just horrendous. I feel awful, and I can't see a way out of this. And I wasn't depressed, but I had that moment when I thought, am I depressed? Is this what postnatal depression is? Because I don't know. I mean, I feel terrible, and I feel like I'm not coping. And I wondered what then was the difference between me and those women that I'd been treating in the hospital. So that was really where it started. The next day, I sat down at my computer and I started writing about the feelings that I was having as a new mum. And I just needed some sleep. That's all I needed. But I really saw then that the line between those women who previously had been other people and me was a very fine line. And so when a lot of the writing in Fractured is inspired by some of my own feelings in that newborn period, but also that feeling of not knowing what was going on. Even as I was a psychiatrist, and I should have known whether or not I was depressed. When you're in the middle of it, it's very hard to tell, and that was what I was trying to capture in Fractured. Where do we draw that line, and how quickly things can go wrong.
Did you find it difficult to write this book, or was it healing for you in a way?
Yeah, I didn't find it too difficult because I quite enjoyed taking all the stuff that I was feeling in the middle of the night and using it to fuel my writing. It was something that, in some ways, I was thinking to myself, okay, there's something I can do with all of this instead of just being really overwhelmed with it all. I can use it in a creative way. So, I mean, there were things that were hard to write, and of course, it's a fairly confronting book. But I was always very clear that it was fiction, and the characters took on a life of their own, but they were fictional characters, and I was very clear I wasn't writing about me or a patient that I treated, and it was just a story, and it's a story that I just felt needed to be told, no matter how confronting it was.
Well, I've got my book club to read it, and I've had a very interesting response from a lot of people. It's sort of opened up a lot of old wounds or created a lot of discussion about it. What sort of response were you hoping to get on this book?
Well, exactly that, really. I mean, it's hard when you write a book. I first of all would have just been amazed to have it published, and when it did get published, it was amazing. And I thought, oh, even if one person buys it, I'd be happy. But you said, you sort of your goals change, and then it was far more mainstream than I thought. I didn't think this would be a book that would be a Dymphs. I thought this would be a book that might be on the back shelf of some independent bookstores. And I was actually amazed that it was really taken on by the main reading public, really. And I think that what was great about that is that, exactly as you said, it opened up conversations. I mean, I haven't gone to one book club or talk yet where there hasn't been someone who's come up and said that they or someone they know has had postnatal depression or a mental health problem. Mental health problems are incredibly common, and 50% of people will have them. And I'm still amazed that at one of the first library talks I did, a woman who was in her 80s was crying during my talk, and she came up to me at the end and she said, I had that, but it wasn't invented then. And I thought that was so interesting. Of course it was invented, it's just that we didn't name it. And even these days there's so much stigma and misunderstanding about mental health problems. So to be able to have forums like this to talk about it, I just think it's fantastic for me as a psychiatrist. Because it really is something I just think if we talk about it more, we might prevent some of the issues that happen.
Well, in the book, Anna obviously wasn't coping with having a new baby. She wasn't getting enough sleep. But it kept being sort of brushed off as being, it's just a new mother thing. And her partner probably wasn't really, as sensitive as he should have been at the beginning to that. And that's quite tragic, because if she did get some help earlier on, maybe would have prevented the baby dying at funeral. Is that what you're hoping as well, is that people talk about this so that women who can identify in a situation like that can actually get help sooner or talk to their doctor or...
Yeah, and I guess when I was writing it, I didn't have that particularly in mind. I wasn't writing it really to try and sort of educate people necessarily, but I suppose what I wanted to do was to highlight that in mental health issues in general, there are often various points at which we could have intervened, and I really wanted to use the characters in Fractured to show that I didn't feel that there's one person to blame, and I've been reading this weekend about that poor DJ who's really, really cut up about the nurse who took her life after the call in London, and how she feels, that woman feels incredibly responsible for that. And my feeling in mental health is that the influences of someone's mental health come from everywhere. They come from, there are lots of people that could do something different, but there are also things within ourselves that we could change. And I don't feel that there's any one person to blame. So I wanted to use lots of characters to show that any of these characters could have taken a different path, including Anna, and it could have changed the outcome. But in reality, we can't go back and say, oh, if you'd done this differently. I mean, in reality, this is a story I felt was quite typical of what happened with a character who's quite isolated. Women these days, including myself, live a long way from the family. They often don't have the support, and women are having children at an older age, so they've often been used to coping. They've had a career, they're fairly independent, and so when they can't cope, it can be a real shock, and it can be hard for people to admit that they need help.
Especially women like Anna who were working and then suddenly stopped, and their entire sort of support system was at work, and they find themselves isolated, not knowing what they're supposed to be doing. I guess assuming that they have to cope, they just, to just get on with it.
Yeah.
Okay, the characters are quite interesting, and there was, you've written from the different points of view. Obviously, there was a lot of guilt and self-blame from everybody, including Anna's partner, Tony, Anna's mother, who also suffered from mental illness, a history of depression. So you move forth between the narrators and in time. You bring us even closer to the event of that fateful day. And it's you might say, a very good gripping reading. Was this the structure you had in mind when you started?
Not really. I'm not very good at planning novels. I tend to just sort of start and see what happens. So when I first wrote it, I wrote it from the point of view of just Anna, but I found it incredibly difficult because Anna is obviously mentally ill in the book, and it's incredibly difficult to get a cohesive narrative when from the point of view of someone whose thoughts were quite disordered. So then I added her husband's point of view, and then again I just felt that something was missing, and I really wanted to add their parents' point of view to try, and I guess as a psychiatrist I generally will see the patient and their immediate family, but I'm very aware that when they leave my office, they are part of a wider system, so they've got their own families, and of course they're part of their communities and the towns and their groups, their workplaces, and all these other systems. So I guess I wanted to use the other characters to, I guess, explore for me in a way what happens when a patient goes home and what's the impact on the wider family, because mental health doesn't happen in isolation, and it happens to families, really. So that was really a way of trying to just show the impact on the wider community.
Did you do, I know you use your own background as a psychiatrist and experience as a mother, but did you have to do any other research as well?
I researched a few of the legal cases of real situations like Anna's, just reading Supreme Court transcripts really, and doing quite a bit of research into the laws around criminal acts and the mentally ill. So that's really about all. I don't like to do too much research, I find, and then I kind of stressed for a long time about how to get that completely right. I mean, there are things that are important to get right, but for me, writing is just something that, I do a lot of research stuff in my day-to-day job, so I quite enjoy just the creative writing of just happen. Yeah.
Because we often read about cases like this, and they're absolutely devastating, but we don't, I guess the media doesn't delve into the mind of the person and the family, and then what happens afterwards as well. How do they actually go on with their lives, or how do they make sense of what happened? So, and which you tried to do at the end as well, for Anna and Tony to come to some
don't tell me.
I can see if you want to. Sorry, had not everyone's read it. That's okay. So there's obviously a lot of guilt experienced by the members of the Patton family, and Wendy, who's the mother of Anna. But he shows that this forgiveness and understanding is necessary, but it doesn't always come easy in a situation like that. So was the complex nature of the mother-child and sibling relationship something that you were consciously chose to explore? You mentioned a bit earlier that you wanted to show other points of view.
Yeah, a little bit, but I guess I'm really interested generally in how families work. It's my job, my day job, but also families are fascinating because you're shoved with people that doesn't matter whether or not you like them. You have to get on with them. So they're the only relationships in our lives where you can't walk away from them. You know, you can try, but you'll always be pulled back together by something. So I guess they're to me quite a fascinating way to just explore how relationships work and how people navigate the bumps in the relationships.
And the fact that parenting is never easy without our children, as you see.
Yeah, and then the
really
parent-child relationship goes on forever with the rest of our lives. It doesn't end when the child leaves home. You still have that protective feeling of your children.
Does anyone have any questions about fractures before we move on to the next book? Any comments about it?
Can I just ask from a clinical perspective, so with your main character, at what point do you think she could have got some help or support? Like, was there a single factor where she should have said, "Oh, I need some help"?
Yeah, I mean, obviously without giving too much away for people who haven't read it. As I sort of said earlier, I think there are multiple points at which she could ask for help, and then indeed you could come in, and in the book she does ask for help in the way, and everybody thinks that they are actually giving her that help, but things don't quite she doesn't get the help that she really needs, and I think that's about the under-recognition of mental health symptoms. So I guess it would have been nice if she asked for help as soon as she wasn't coping, but that's not how life works. So it's the everyday, unfortunately. I guess it's about recognizing symptoms in yourself and then knowing that you need help and knowing where to go to get that help. And I think that's what generally in life people are not very good at doing that.
Do you think she got the help she needed from the professionals?
No. Well, I think everybody tries their best, and I guess that's the other thing. And not everything in life is treatable or preventable, and people can only do what they can do, and we can't stop everybody from being unwell, and that's
and they have a choice as well in their wellness as well.
Yeah,
follow through with your advice.
Of course, yeah.
Can I just ask again, how important is sleep in that?
Yeah.
In other words, if we could just have 6 hours unbroken sleep, can we go?
Oh, I've had 6 hours unbroken sleep. Look, sleep is really important, and it's hard with postnatal mental illnesses. It's like all mental illnesses, who knows what goes into a combination of genes and environmental factors and social factors and everything. But we know that, for example, people with bipolar disorder, a lack of sleep is one of the big triggers for manic or depressive episodes. So it certainly is important, and it's likely that in postnatal psychosis it's a combination of a lack of sleep plus a gene plus the massive hormonal shifts that go on after birth. So there's just a lot of things. But yes, sleep is important.
Following on from that, and then I have another one. Just that whole thing. Obviously, when you have lack of sleep, you don't make good decisions. So that would be exacerbate the whole problem. Yeah. I just have a question about writing in general. I recently listened to a talk, a TED talk or something by it wasn't actually a TED talk, it was another follow-up, but by Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat Like and she said that she never went to creative school. She never did any creative writing at a school or study. And she said because she felt that was going to be the worst thing that she could possibly do. How did you find that helped your? Well, obviously you said that after you did it, you kick-started. What is good and what is not so good about going to?
I think it depends what you're looking for. I did that little night course class in uni, and then when I was writing Fractured, I actually did it through a course run by the Queensland Writers' Centre, which was an online 12-month novel writing course. what was interesting about that course, it's nothing that I couldn't have learned from a book, really, if I wanted to know about how to structure a novel. Certainly nothing I couldn't have learned from just reading widely and taking note of how other authors structured the novels and things like that. But what was good for me is that it was a group of people who were all writing the first novel, and 2 others in that group are now published as well. So we were all pretty serious about writing, and it was just a little support group, and there was an element of competitiveness to it to keep us going. For example, each week we had to say how many words we'd written. And previously it would take me about 3 years to write 200 words. I was waiting for the time, I was waiting for the inspiration to strike, I was waiting for the perfect sentence. And it never comes. And what it taught me to do is to treat writing like a job, and to write every day. And I write 500 words a day, Monday to Friday. And I usually end up writing more, but that's my limit. And so when I did that course and just stuck to my word limit, 6 months later I had the first draft of a novel and took it from there. So they can just be a really useful way to get you in that community. I mean, some people would like it more than others to learn structure, but I think if you read widely and you're interested, you don't necessarily need them, but for some people it can.
Question at the back.
I was going to ask, sorry, I wanted to say one thing about the sleep. When I was 8.5 months pregnant and far too far down the track to be changing anything, I rang a friend who had a little girl and said, how do you learn to deal with the sleep deprivation? You know, what do I kind of have to know before I go into the next month? And there was this awful pause on the phone, and she said, you never learn to deal with it. And I said, why does no one tell you this earlier? And she said, because then no one would have children. And
it doesn't end, does it?
But I wanted to ask if you thought there was a link between, you know, obviously psychiatry is about communicating with people, it's about getting them to tell you their stories. And if you think there's a natural link between the work that you do as a psychiatrist and the work that you do now as a writer, they sort of, not if they, I mean, obviously they feed each other directly in these 2 books, but more in general.
Definitely. I think what I do in psychiatry is deal with patients' stories all the time and deal with narratives and crises. And I often think it's a little bit like when a patient walks through my door, it's a little bit like the blurb or the opening, you know, the hook on the front of the book. It's someone comes to you kind of in crisis. And what you spend the rest of your time doing as a psychiatrist is finding out what got them to that point. Similarly to a novel, you kind of explore the backstory and also helping them to hopefully overcome those flaws and have some sort of resolution at the end. So yeah, I think it's that similar arc to it. And I think it's also a reader and a writer. It's almost like that therapeutic relationship between a doctor and a patient, where it's actually not what happens on the page that is the story. It's what happens in the middle. It's what happens between the reader and the writer in that magical space, and that's why none of us have the same reactions to the same books. We all bring our own stuff to that relationship, and I think a doctor-patient relationship is very similar. We all know there are doctors we really like and others that we don't, and it's not necessarily anything to do with their clinical judgment. It's because they remind us of someone, or we don't like their attitude, or whatever it is, but it's something about us and them rather than them in isolation. So I think that's the other similarity.
Yeah, I'm part of May's book club and read the book and loved it. It was sort of like I loved it, but I didn't because of the content, you know. So you're sort of reading it, and again, yeah, you bring your own things to it and memories. And again, I was one of those people that went to mental health crying because it's like, what is wrong with me? And you know, the lack of sleep sort of thing has totally overwhelmed you. I really like the way that you ended it, and I just sort of, it makes you think what happens for them now. So generally you would expect that someone like Anna would continue to, would be recommended to go and see someone continually to sort of have that resolution, and for Tony as well. I mean, I know from on the male perspective, when he caught up with his best mate, it was very, let's go for a drink, and you know, that typical of males, I suppose, in some ways. But yeah, think of the male side of it and the connection with postnatal depression as well. Do you have much exposure with it?
I'm done with it. Me too much. Yeah, you're right. The male perspective was one I was keen to include. And my research for that was chatting to my husband. I was like, oh, what do you do in this situation? And what do men do? Where do men talk? And men talk. My husband certainly talks down the pub with his mates. That's where people relax and have a chat. So that's why he ended up in the pub rather than having a coffee and a chat, which I think is what we tend to do. I'm generalising there, but I think men deal with it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm kind of Marie's book sorry. So when I read the book, I sort of felt quite sorry for Tony for the most of the novel. And then right at the end, you've got the questions with thoughts, and you said, should Tony be held more responsible? And I kind of did this big 180 and thought, yes, I got really angry because he could have done something, and at the end of the day, Anne was the one that sort of had all the amazing stuff happen to you. So from your sort of research legally, is there anything where the fathers take on any of the blame?
Not in a legal way, no.
So when a child is angry or not?
No, but I mean, again, I know there's some people who haven't read it, but I guess my feeling as I wrote it is that there wasn't anyone to blame, legally or morally. I tried to portray a situation where it was very hard to lay fault on any particular person. But it's interesting because people have very different reactions to the characters, and it's quite polarizing.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because I felt when I read it that Tony was, like, he was blaming himself and feeling guilt and stuff, but I felt, well, the way I read it was leading towards blaming him, but then I thought, like, before the child, he was the perfect husband, and then after he's seen as not the perfect husband, but, but was your intention just to make
My intention was just to make the characters fairly realistic and like sort of modelled on people I know, and I guess with my characters, I'm not really interested in writing purely likable characters. I don't think anybody in life is purely likable. Even the people that are, my really good friends have things about them that annoy me. And I'm sure I annoy people too, even my friends. So I like to have characters that sometimes people don't like as much, but I think that makes them more realistic and more complex. People are complex, and the books I write are, there are certain books where you would have likable characters, and that's totally fine, but it's just not the sort of stuff that I want to write.
Sorry, a couple more questions before we move on to the next book.
One on the postnatal depression and other attendant mental health issues with pregnancy go, post-pregnancy go. How much influence does the fact that women have children much later in life now compared to historically play in exacerbating that problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I tried to do a bit of research. For me saying I did too much research, I did try and look into that. The main, it's been hard to tell. There's certainly a lot more stresses involved with older pregnancies in that fertility rates are lower, so people are more likely to have fertility treatment, which in itself brings a lot of emotional and financial costs. What I mentioned earlier as well about women having had more control over their lives. There's been a few studies on that older women, because they've had, as I said earlier, careers and been very used to being obsessively in control of everything, struggle when they're not. Whereas if you have, the argument is that if you have children younger, you I guess you haven't set up that sort of relationship with yourself where you're in control. And of course, there's also higher risks within the pregnancy, and the babies have higher risks of having problems too. So all those things probably do combine, but there's not really any good studies that I've seen yet on rates of actual mental illnesses in those women. But I think it's a really interesting point.
I was just going to say, is it recognised that men have postnatal depression as well?
Well, there is a little bit of, there are, people have said that males can have postnatal depression. I think men can have depression, and it may be in the postnatal period, and it doesn't validate them having a depressive illness, but I tend to think of the postnatal mental illnesses to be something driven biologically, excuse me, as well, and hormonally. So they certainly can have depression in that time, but I hesitate to use the term postnatal depression because I think what happens for women is more than a psychological reaction to birth and to pregnancy. It's something far more biological, I think.
Last question.
I haven't read it yet, but generally speaking, in terms of, there are a lot of everyone's someone or has experienced postnatal depression, by and large. So what are some of the things that we can do that can mitigate some of the risk factors for mothers who, are likely to end up postnatal or are at risk?
Yeah,
So what can we do?
I think the biggest thing for people to do is to be on the lookout for warning symptoms. So if they see someone who seems to be withdrawing, who seems to be lower in their mood, who's teary, who's not sleeping, those sorts of things. It's about not being afraid to ask if they're okay, and if you're worried about them, to make sure that somebody finds out, whether that's the GP or their midwife or the childhood nurse, and just to let the professional know, because professionals, when they know about it, there's a great system to support them, but it's about people recognising symptoms in themselves and in others. I think that's the biggest thing that we can do.
What about before anyone becomes symptomatic, so that in the structures of our lives, as we prepare to have our first baby, or as we do any of those sorts of things, what are the things that we can inform each other of, or be prepared for, and have systems set up so that women, we can hopefully prevent it actually reaching to the point that they actually fall into it.
Yeah, but I guess the things are having a good support system. That's really important. A lot of the other factors are things that we can't necessarily do something about, like risk factors would be, a young age or poor socioeconomic factors. We can't mitigate for those, but I think we can make sure that there are good support structures in place. And I think that's a really important one.
Just in response to that, I think one of the smartest things I heard someone say was, we tend to be far too polite with each other these days. So if you're having a shit of a day and someone says, "Are you okay?" you go, "Yeah, I'm fine." And I think there's that great thing of, it's not about saying, "Are you okay?" It's about turning up, with spaghetti bolognese and 3 hours, so that you do the washing, you hang the washing out, the mother goes to sleep, and take the child away. It's sort of not even about asking, it's just about being present and doing something really, which we don't automatically do so much.
So putting the responsibility on the community.
Yeah,
It's not an awareness issue, it's not just a couple's problem or a woman's problem. Now, you mentioned fertility earlier, all the age, so that leads us well into your next book, your latest one, Let Her Go.
Yes.
Would you like to just talk about the book and the characters and what it's about?
Okay. So Let Her Go. My second novel came out a couple of months ago now. So it is the story of two stepsisters, one of whom acts as a surrogate for the other. So we have three main characters. Zoe, who's a lady who has a chronic medical illness, lupus, which means that she can't have her own children, and her sister Nadia, who is in many ways the picture of the perfect mother. She's got 3 children of her own. She has a reasonably happy marriage, although of course we all know that behind every marriage there are simmering resentments and issues there. And there's a third thread in the story, which is of a teenage girl called Louise, who is at a crisis point in her life where she's really struggling to find her identity, is acting out behaviourally, has some mental health problems herself, and I guess we follow these women to find out where the secrets lie in the family and to whom we really belong, I guess.
Okay. So obviously, without giving away too much in the book, Zoe is quite keen to have a baby, and her stepsister Nadia offers to help her by being a surrogate and carries a baby for her, using Zoe's partner Lachlan's sperm, but her own eggs. So in effect, she's giving birth to her own baby, but the baby was to be handed back to the mother. What was the inspiration behind writing this? What made you?
Yeah, again, a few things. I had one of those theoretical conversations once with my sister-in-law. We've maybe all had them, where we'd heard something about surrogacy, and I said, "Well, I'd do it for you." And she said, "Oh, I'd do it for you." And I said, "I wouldn't do it for a stranger." And we had this sort of talk, and we didn't think it would be that hard, really. And then when I was thinking about writing my second novel, I had a contract for a second novel that I hadn't even had an idea for yet, and I had to deliver it within a year. So I was frantically thinking, what ideas have I got brewing? And this conversation came back to me, and I was pregnant at that time, I think, with my 3rd child. And I remember thinking to myself, actually, no, I couldn't give this baby to my sister-in-law. And in some ways, if I was going to do it, I'd rather give it to someone where I would see the baby, because I couldn't bear to watch my child being brought up by someone else. So I was starting to think about this, and then I saw an episode of Australian Story, and I get lots of ideas from Australian Story. It's always got great stories. And there was an Australian surrogate on the show. Sorry, an Australian woman who was using an American surrogate. So it was a different type of surrogacy, commercial surrogacy, where you pay someone money for the child. And there were a couple of things in that show that again just got me thinking, and one of them was a scene where the American surrogate had come back to Australia for the child's first birthday. And there was one brief scene in the show where the surrogate was holding her own child, the 1-year-old, and gazing into her eyes in that way that we do with our own children, having that real connection. And you could see the Australian woman just looking on with a sort of big smile on her face, looking very tense. And it was just a fleeting moment, and I started to think to myself, wow, what would that be like? You know, has this woman bonded with her child because she carried it for 9 months? And we all know that a lot of the bonding happens when you're pregnant. So it really just started from there, and I just started to think about the psychological effects on everyone involved, including the child, because I think we often forget about the child and all of this, and I think the recent stuff on baby gammy has really highlighted that there's a kid at the middle of this who will grow up and need to know where they come from. So
is that why you felt it was important to include Louise's, who's the child here?
Yeah. So when I wrote the first draft, I'd written both the sisters' points of view, but I read back through it and I just felt that something was missing, and then it came to me that what was missing was the voice of the child. And as I said, I think because that's something that's missing in society as well. The children have no say in surrogacy and in fertility treatments in general, really in all sorts of, even when we just go to have pregnancy the good old-fashioned way, the children don't have a choice in it. So I think when we're particularly doing things like surrogacy, which is really complex psychologically and ethically and legally, I really felt that I needed to make sure that that child had a voice. And there was, I was trying to do some research for this book and came across a blog called Son of a Surrogate, which is closed down now, but it's still all up on the internet. And it was written by an American child, son of a surrogate, who at about 16 or 17 was keeping this blog because he was completely devastated when he found out the way in which he was conceived through surrogacy. He said that he felt as angry and as rejected as someone who'd been given up for adoption. And he said he felt even worse because money had traded hands for him. And he still felt that his biological mother had given him up, no matter how much his other mother wanted him. He felt very, very strongly that he was like a child who'd been given up. And so that was really what got me going with the idea of having an adolescent in the story too.
So surrogacy is becoming more common. Like I said earlier, women are having babies much later, and there's different ways where they go to India and have a donor egg and a surrogate, or they use their own egg. So there's lots of different ways. Do you think people aren't maybe thinking through the psychological aspects of, or the long-term impact this is going to have on the child?
Well, I think people do. I think people do give a lot of thought. I mean, particularly if you do it in Australia, you have to have a long process of counselling, psychiatric assessments, legal assessments. There's a big process. I think. I mean, and I guess the other thing to point out is that most children do very well. The vast majority of surrogacies go really well, and of course there will be grief issues and there will be complications psychologically, I think, but most kids do really well. But I just think generally, one of the books that inspired me to write this book was Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, which of course is a dystopian speculative fiction set in the future where there are these women who are kept in a place to have babies for richer women who can't have children of their own. And really when we see what is happening in some of these surrogacy clinics, if you want to call them that, in India, things where women are admitted at the beginning of their pregnancy and so that their entire pregnancy is monitored. It's a worry. It's not that far away from that. So that's I just it's one of those things where I feel I like to write about issues that make me feel quite uncomfortable. And I still, at the end of this book, I was hoping I'd come to some resolution about my feelings of surrogacy. And on an individual level, I've spoken to lots of surrogates and researching this book, and they do an amazing job, and I think they're wonderful. But then when we hear stories like baby gammy, which is of course the exception, I just think to myself, my goodness, what are we doing? are we thinking enough about what we're doing ethically? Just because we can do it, I'm not sure we should. So I'm still very undecided.
I guess the book's really good at exploring issues of loss and grief, because anyone who's experienced infertility, they would know how much grief there is. It's almost like a private group, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which people can't really understand when they've been in that situation. But there's also the grief of having to give up a baby that you thought you could give up, but then maybe you couldn't at the end. Maybe there's grief within the family with the child growing up. So what can you say about that?
Well, there was one line when you were asking that came to mind about someone I was interviewing. She said to me, surrogate, she said, it was, my head knew that the baby wasn't mine, and she handed over, and she said, but my body didn't understand. And that was a really powerful statement for me, because I think no matter how much psychological preparation we can have, there is a physical response to having a child. If you give birth to a baby, physically your body is flooded with hormones, with oxytocin, which starts to produce milk, and there's so many studies done about the changes in your body, and your instinct is to hold your child and to feed your child. It's how species survive. It's an animal instinct, really. So I think that's important to remember, that we can think about it psychologically and prepare ourselves, but we can't prepare our bodies completely for that. And a lot of surrogates continue to breastfeed the children, which I find is fascinating, because that again is another big bonding time for mothers and babies, and it's very common that the surrogates will continue to breastfeed the child for a while as well. So that's fascinating in itself.
So this is a very interesting topic, because there's a lot of emotional issues and ethical issues, as well as some legal issues. Did you have to do quite a bit of research around?
Yeah, a little bit. The legal issues are tricky because each state has different laws. So there was one legal case that really sort of prompted me to write this, and I've forgotten the name of the case, but it was my sister-in-law was studying law at the time, and she was doing her family law unit, and this is the case they're given to learn about surrogacy. It was a case in the Queensland, the Queensland family courts, where there had been an unofficial surrogacy between two couples who were friends, bit of home insemination, and they sort of had an unofficial arrangement. But then, after the surrogate, after the surrogate had the baby, she started to accuse the other woman who had the child of not doing things properly, not giving her the right milk, not looking after the baby properly. Clearly, these were actually just the grief issues. It was interesting reading the court transcript, because it was very much just the facts, and I guess we could all read behind the facts. But then one day, the woman, the other couple had moved into state by this time, the woman got in her car, she drove, I think it was from Queensland to South Australia, and she picked up the baby, who was biologically her child, and she left with it, and she went back home, and she just took the baby from his family. And then, of course, it went to court, and there was a big sort of custody dispute. And what was really interesting about that case is that the judge was saying either of these couples would make great parents. This is not a case of someone who's not a good parent. And how do you decide who is the true parent of this child? Is it the person who's got the most biological link to the child? Is it the person who's carried the child? Or is it the person who's been raising the child? And it was a really, really tricky case, and that's, I guess, another one of the legal aspects that led me to write.
And what's in the best interest of the child, which is what courts always.
Exactly, that's what the law states, what is in the best interest of the child. But when you have a child who's got links to both families, it's really hard even to know that, and the judge ended up sort of trying to award kind of joint custody. It was very sort of wishy-washy and really, really hard. But that's the reality. The judge was in a terrible position. It's such an unusual thing to happen. Of course, it's so rare that happens. But each state has different laws, so there are different procedures in each state. But it's quite a complex area.
And it's complex in this novel because it's between two stepsisters, and so their family, they're always going to be around under legal or a business arrangement that they might have gotten into with a surrogate overseas, and the relationship sort of ends when the baby's taken away. So that's why you explore that in the book.
Yeah.
It shows that you seem to really like exploring family relationships, and is that what you set out to do, or you?
Again, it's funny. When kind of writing books, I don't particularly think that that's what I'm going to do. It just kind of happens. It's just the way it sort of worked out. And I guess I just, as I said earlier, I think I just gravitate towards that because I have a young family myself, and I guess I'm writing about children about the age of my children, and it's impossible not to put in aspects of my own experiences there. But also just with my work, it's what I do. I work with families all the time, so I think it's just something that I've drifted towards.
Well, I found the book quite gripping, so I won't give it away, but you keep reading to find out what happens to this child, and whilst you're reading about the complexity of the situation and the complex relationship between everybody, and I guess it's easy for us to judge and say, oh well, they shouldn't be having kids. This is too hard, but at the same time, as parents, we know how joyful it is to have kids, as hard as it can be sometimes. And everyone, should everyone have the right to that? So it raises a lot of ethical questions as well. What are you hoping people will take away from this book? What conversations do you want to think about?
Yeah, again, primarily I was writing this to explore my own feelings about it, to think about how I feel about surrogacy and fertility and all those sorts of things. But I guess, again, it's particularly with all the media stories we've all seen recently about surrogacy, I hope it just starts some conversations and makes people think. Again, surrogacy is not that common, but it's more common. You think the more amount of people I've spoken to about this book will say, oh, so-and-so at the hospital, they've got surrogate children, and so-and-so's just gone to America, and someone else I met whose father had just gone overseas to get a surrogate pregnancy there. And it actually is happening more than we think. There's a lot of unofficial surrogacies as well. There's not that many go through the courts in Australia because it's a very complex procedure, so people will go overseas where there's far less regulations. And I was speaking to quite a few people in the gay communities, and they said that it happens quite a lot unofficially. There's unofficial arrangements between friends and couples, and it happens quite a lot. So I just think it's, again, something that I just hope that people have conversations about it, and again think about the central issue, which is actually the child, and we have to keep the child central the whole time.
And I guess despite the complexity, these children are very much wanted and loved.
Of
and
course,
that ultimately the outcome is good, that they've got children they want and love. Any questions or any comments about this?
I've got a couple. Lots really, but the whole conversation. But in terms of thinking about the child being their best interest and all that stuff, that's kind of for me. When you start talking about surrogacy, talking about donor eggs or donor sperm, or all the combinations and permutations can happen, and that it's about the adults wanting a child. Like that's really what the whole purpose is. It's not actually about the child's best interest in their inception. And when you're thinking about that kind of stuff in the sense of, is it a right? Is it an entitlement to inherit? Or are we just being selfish around some of that stuff? And is there not some validity and some value in learning to cope with that life isn't fair? That this is what life has dealt with, and isn't there an important lesson to learning that, particularly in this day of entitlement with our kids coming up and learning, saying it's my right for everything, to actually say it's not.
Good point. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think it's one of the questions that I tried to raise in the book as well, and I get it's hard. I don't particularly want to comment too much about that because I have 3 children and I can't pretend to know what it's like to not be able to have children, and I can only imagine that the pull, the drive to have children would be incredibly strong to go to these lengths to have a child. But I think you've got some valid points as well.
How does that go? I'd love you to write a book then actually about things like adoption, in the context of if you've got surrogacy versus adoption, like is that one of the reasons why there's so much surrogacy, because adoption is so prohibited?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons for the increased use of surrogacy, because the adoption laws have changed quite a lot in Australia in the last decade or so. Things, for example, same-sex couples aren't allowed to adopt from overseas, so not here, but they can be surrogates from some states, not in WA, but in other states you can. So it's also there's been a real shift in child protection laws so that children, instead of being put up for adoption, are far more put up for long-term foster care with the hope of getting them back with their parents eventually. So there's actually far fewer children available for adoption, and the laws are quite prohibitive as well, which is one of the reasons for the rise in surrogacy.
There are no simple answers to this thing.
No.
Yeah, very, very complex issues.
Dawn, have there been any studies done on whether children in the surrogate situation, surrogate children, whether they do better or worse from a gay couple to a heterosexual couple?
I haven't seen that actually, and there must be studies underway given that it's happening so much more often these days. At one point I did see a study, and I don't know how big a study it was, how robust a study it was, showing, and certainly it's been the case with surrogate children versus non-surrogate children, that in some studies it shows that they do better, because there's a feeling that because there's been so much investment put into having a child, and often there may only be one child, there's a lot of opportunity and attention and love given to that child, and all children are loved. But in terms of a kind of decent big study, I don't know of any yet, but it'd be really, really interesting to see.
No doubt we'll be more down the track with more surrogate children growing up.
Well, I know gay couples have gone over to America 5-6 years ago, and they spent $350,000
That's right.
each.
Yeah, I've toyed with which question. The creative question I'm going to ask. Do you like to now? Do you keep, as you're writing that book, do you keep coming up with ideas? I mean, obviously an individual thing, but I'd like to know what happens with you. Do you keep coming up with ideas for your next book, or do you try to put those out of your mind, or completely until you've finished, and then and also the next one part of that would be, do you give yourself a break and do you kind of go, I'm not going to write for 6 months and come back to it? And then how do you focus that all with your 3 children and then do you work? Do you work and sleep? I presume it doesn't.
It's a very good question. So in terms of ideas for the next book, I sort of have ideas for my next 2 books that I've had. I kind of, before I've started one book, I tend to have the idea for the book after, and I think that's because I start to panic that I'm not writing the right book. Certainly when I started writing this one, and I remember calling my agent and saying, I just don't think it's the right book, I think I should do the other book instead. And so I've had the idea for the book, I'm just starting since the start of this book, and I've just had the idea for the next book, and I said to myself, well, maybe the one I'm about to start isn't the right one, and maybe I should do this one. So I think that's just a bit of myself doubting what I'm doing, but it's good to have ideas, so I'm glad I do have a couple of ideas. And what was the second part of that question? About
how do you do it all?
How do you do it all?
Do you take a break?
Oh, do I take a break? That's right. Yeah, I'm struggling at the moment to do it all. It was easier when I was writing Fractured. I just had one baby, so I would write while she napped, and I would just have my little 500 words a day word limit, and then if I'm on a roll, I can do that in half an hour. It doesn't necessarily take long to write 500 words. I should qualify that because I don't ever read back what I've written in my first draft, so it can be completely rubbish, 500 words. But my aim in the first draft is just to keep going and get to the end of it, and then I go back and start editing once I've kind of, because I don't plan the novel, it kind of just evolves as it goes. So now I have 3 kids, and I thought it would be easier when one of them was at school, and it's kind of not really. So I'm struggling. So what I do at the moment is I'm about to have couple of mornings of childcare, and that'll be my prescribed writing time, and otherwise I get up early. I get up at 5:30 and I do an hour before the day starts. I find I'm knackered by the end of the day and I just can't write at the end of the day, so I try and get it done in the morning, otherwise I just worry about it all day and think I haven't done my work. So it's hard, and I have to really compartmentalize my life, so I have my one day of work, and I don't check my work emails other than on that day. And I have my 2 days of writing, and I don't use those to go for coffee or shopping much as I'd like to. I have to say I'm working, and I go to the library and I work those days. Otherwise, it's too easy to just find something else to do in this time.
Can you tell us about the future books coming out at this stage, or not?
It's only just in evolution, but I guess it's going back to themes of mental health. perhaps more like the first one, but really dealing with the extremes of our beliefs in society about childhood mental illness. So it involves religion, cultish religions, and children with mental illnesses being overdiagnosed and searching for what the real truth is. So it's very vague at the moment.
It's good to know that you're quite courageous, you're not afraid of exploring these difficult topics that maybe some people would stay away from, too hard.
So with surrogacy, you know, most of the time people focus on the mother and the husband, you know, that have to have a child and stuff like that. But then, like, did you ever think to focus on the, you know, the grandparents are losing a grandchild, and it's a whole family around the situation, and
I do have the grandparents in that result, because it's the same parents, of course, as step sisters, so they've got a blended family. So yeah, I mean that's an issue as well, and I think the issue when because in Australia only altruistic surrogacy is legal, it's often done within families and within friends. So it certainly is an issue where friends and family can be pulled because they're sort of caught in the middle of really wanting the best for the grandchild, but being pulled between the two sisters.
Last question before we wrap up.
I was just going to say that culturally, is that more that, say, Australians, Americans, English, are more protective about that family unit, whereas I know that friends of mine in Vanuatu had adopted 2 kids from Vanuatu, and they said they're quite liberal. So if a family said, oh, it's just a bit too much, even with the extended family helping looking after the baby, this is how they got to adopt their baby, because they were just like, no, it's just a bit too much, and they were okay with it. And then they said, another family, they said they've got like all boys and they wanted a girl, so they'll just swap with another family, and it's quite, like they're quite
traditional surrogacy practices in the Pacific Islands going on for generations. It is actually in other cultures. It's not that uncommon for sisters to have babies. Sisters, they can't have one. The sister has one and gives it to. And I think it's because they do have those different family structures where the children are often raised by a much wider family, whereas we, as you said, tend to have that traditional family unit. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Of course, with commercial surrogacy, poverty is the main factor as well. Is that a lot of the surrogates, they do earn a lot of money in a way, you know, doing that. You know, they wouldn't earn that sort of money anywhere else. So a lot of difficulty.
What do you think in terms of like the child, in either of these sort of concepts, and in different cultures, around the concept of identity for the child, and what all of these circumstances and situations might mean, and what that actually means for the child's health and mental health?
Yeah, well, that's I guess why I wanted to have that adolescent thread in it, because adolescence is a time of identity formation. It's when we do try and find out where we are, and we join our little subcultures to try and find where we fit as teenagers until we kind of get through the other side and hopefully emerge as a secure adult. So yeah, look, it's a big issue, and we've seen it recently with disclosure about donor eggs and sperm. The law's being changed on that because people, teenagers and adults, do want to know where they belong and their identity.
Okay, I think it's time for us to wrap this up. Thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank you.